In the heart of Hollywood's Dolby Theater, a towering crowd pleaser was about to make the one joke he should never have told. The glittering calm of the 98th Academy Awards turned deadly serious when a global audience, a room full of A-list power players and one very real legend, reacted to a single line that crossed the wrong boundary. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson wasn't your typical action star showman. For decades, he had been a world-famous entertainer and former WWE Titan. Known for electrifying crowds, improvising under pressure, and owning every room he entered. When Chuck Norris rose from his seat without a word, the crowd hushed instantly. They had no idea they were staring at a man whose quiet stillness could flip a global broadcast on its head. Dwayne, mid-joke, felt the airdrop and instincts fire, launching a desperate on-stage recalibration that would trigger a full-scale shift from comedy to crisis management. What began as a harmless roast during an awards night monologue would become a live, unscripted reckoning watched by 400 million people. The Academy Awards and Hollywood itself would never be the same after the confrontation that followed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The red carpet stretched like a golden river through the heart of Hollywood. Cameras flashing and choreographed bursts as limousines deposited their glittering cargo into the night. February 22nd, 2026. The 98th Academy Awards. Outside the Dolby Theater, everything moved with the precision of a Swiss watch. Every step planned, every smile timed, every soundbite rehearsed until it felt spontaneous. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson stepped from his black Escalade, the crowd's roar washing over him like a familiar tide. 6'5" of pure charisma wrapped in a Tom Ford tuxedo, he moved through the press gauntlet with the ease of a man born for spotlights. His publicist, trailing 3 steps behind, barely kept pace as microphones thrust toward him like hungry flowers seeking sunlight. Rock, rock. Any surprises tonight? Entertainment Tonight's correspondent leaned in, her smile as bright as the Klieg lights overhead. Dwayne's grin widened, that trademark eyebrow arching just enough to signal mischief. Oh, you know me. I might have something special cooked up. He winked, causing another wave of camera clicks. Let's just say I've been working on my delivery. Some people might not see it coming. 20 minutes later, in the cool sanctuary of the Theat's backstage corridors, that same confident energy filled the air around him like cologne. The walls here were painted institutional beige, a stark contrast to the opulence beyond the curtain. Dwayne stood with Trent Maddox, the night's host, their voices low but animated as they reviewed last-minute changes to the script. The Chuck Norris bit, Trent said, tablet in hand, scrolling through the teleprompter feed. Writers think it's solid gold. Even Chuck Norris checks under his bed for Oscar winners. He paused, looked up. But you know the room better than anyone. Too much? Dwayne shook his head, that confidence radiating from every gesture. Brother, I've been making rooms laugh since I could throw a punch. Chuck's a legend. He'll appreciate the love. Besides, he chuckled, adjusting his bow tie in a nearby mirror, it's not like I'm roasting him. Just having some fun with the mythology. The mythology. That was exactly how Dwayne saw it. Chuck Norris, as cultural artifact, internet meme, the kind of larger-than-all-life figure who existed more in jokes than reality, it never occurred to him that the man behind the myth might be sitting 20 feet from the stage, 3 floors above in the control room that served as the nerve center for the global broadcast. Maya Alvarez moved like a conductor before her orchestra. Banks of monitors covered the walls, each showing different camera angles of the theater below. Her headset crackled with constant chatter from camera operators. Audio technicians and stage managers scattered throughout the building. Maya had climbed from production assistant to executive producer in 8 years, fueled by an almost supernatural ability to predict and prevent disasters. She'd weathered envelope mix-ups, teleprompter failures, and even a small fire in the West Wing during the 2024 ceremony. Tonight felt different, though, almost too smooth. Her team moved with practice efficiency, but Ma's instincts, honed by years of live television, kept her on edge. Camera 3. "Give me a wide shot of the front section," she said into her headset, watching as the lens swept across the audience. "Hold there. I want to see who's sitting with the owners on the monitor." The camera settled on the first few rows of the orchestra section. Maya's eyes tracked across familiar faces, directors, producers, actors whose names had become synonymous with excellence. Then the lens found someone who made her pause. Chuck Norris sat quietly in the third seat from the aisle, his presence somehow both understated and commanding. No entourage surrounded him. No publicist whispered in his ear. He wore a simple black tuxedo that looked like it had been hanging in his closet for decades, pressed but not flashy. His weathered hands rested calmly on his knees as he listened to the woman beside him. Evelyn Sharp, the 90-year-old actress, whose career spanned 7 decades and who could silence a room with a raised eyebrow. Marcus Maya called to her camera director seated at the console below her. "When we get to the humanitarian segment, remember, Chuck Norris is there for the Stoyart Foundation Award. Keep it respectful. Clean shots. No lingering. He's not here to be gawked at." Marcus Hale nodded without taking his eyes off his monitors. 23 years behind the camera. From local news to the Olympics to this, the biggest stage of them all. He understood the unspoken rules of covering legends. Some people earned their privacy even in public spaces. Copy that. We've got him marked for the tribute package in the presentation. Otherwise, he's background unless he does something newsworthy. Maya almost laughed at that. "Marcus, the man hasn't done anything newsworthy in 15 years. Unless you count teaching martial arts to underprivileged kids. Let's keep it that way." Down in the theater, oblivious to the cameras marking his position, Chuck adjusted his cufflinks and leaned slightly toward Evelyn. The ambient noise of 3,000 people settling into their seats created a gentle buzz around them. But their conversation remained private, intimate. "Nervous?" Evelyn asked, her voice carrying the kind of warmth that had made her America's grandmother on screen and off. Chuck's smile was small but genuine. "About the speech?" "No, about being here. Surrounded by all this," he gestured vaguely at the controlled chaos around them. Cameras sweeping overhead, coordinators speaking rapidly into earpieces, celebrities air-kissing their way down the aisles. It's been a while. Evelyn studied his face, reading the layers of meaning beneath his words. She'd known Chuck for 12 years, ever since they'd worked together on a children's literacy campaign. She understood that his discomfort wasn't with attention. The man had been famous for 40 years, but with the nature of that attention, here in this temple, to Hollywood artifice, his kind of quiet authenticity felt almost revolutionary. "You know, they'll probably mention the old days," she said gently. "The movies, the shows, all of that." "I know." Chuck's voice carried no resentment, just acceptance. "But that's not why I'm here. The foundation pulled 300 kids out of gang life last year, built 14 community centers. That's what matters." The house lights dimmed slightly, a signal that showtime approached. Around them, conversations lowered to whispers. Phones disappeared into pockets and purses, and the energy in the room shifted from social to electric anticipation. In the wings stage left, Dwayne rolled his shoulders, loosening the tension that always built before a performance. This was his element the moment before stepping into the light, when potential energy coiled in his chest like a spring. He'd presented at award shows dozens of times, hosted Saturday Night Live, commanded rooms filled with world leaders and captains of industry. Tonight would be no different. "You're going to kill out there," said Sarah Chen, the show's head writer, peering at his elbow with a tablet showing his final script. "The Chuck Norris bit tests really well with focus groups. Everyone loves a good mythology gag." Dwayne nodded, scanning the words one more time, though he barely needed to. He'd been improvising around written material for so long that scripts served more as suggestions than gospel. "Just remember, it's all about the delivery. We're celebrating the legend, not tearing him down." "Absolutely. It's affectionate roasting." "Classic awards show stuff? Classic awards show stuff?" The phrase would echo in Dwayne's mind later when he realized how little he understood about the man he was about to make the subject of his humor. Trent Maddox paced nearby, his nervous energy manifesting in small ticks straightening his jacket. Checking his pocket watch, running lines under his breath. At 38, He'd finally reached the pinnacle of his career, hosting the Oscars. The months of preparation, the pressure, the knowledge that every word would be dissected by millions, it all culminated in this moment. "Hey, Rock," he called over, needing the reassurance that came from shared confidence. "Please tell me nothing's going to go viral for the wrong reasons tonight." "What?" Wayne laughed. That rich sound that had charmed audiences for 2 decades. "Brother, when have I ever let you down? We're going to give them a show they'll never forget." The stage manager appeared, headset glowing. In the dim backstage light, 5 minutes to places. Ooh, minutes. Maya's voice crackled through every earpiece in the building. "All right, people, this is it. We're live to the world in 5. Remember 3.5 hours of perfect television? No mistakes, no surprises, no problems. Let's make some magic." In the control room, banks of monitors showed camera angles from every conceivable position. The global audience was already massive. Streaming numbers showed viewers from Shanghai to Sao Paulo, settling in for Hollywood's biggest night. Maya felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with live television. That drug-like high of orchestrating organized chaos for millions of witnesses. "Camera 4, give me a nice slow push on the audience. Camera 7, I want you ready for the host entrance. Audio, check levels on Trent's wireless. And remember, people were telling a story tonight. Every shot matters." Marcus's fingers moved across his control board like a pianist approaching a familiar sonata. Each camera angle told part of the larger narrative, and he conducted them with the precision of a master craftsman. On his primary monitor, Chuck Norris sat quietly, apparently unaware that his image was being captured and cataloged for potential use. "Maya, should we get a pre-show shot of Chuck, just in case social media wants to see him here?" Maya considered it for a moment, then shook her head. Leave him be. If he wanted to be part of the pre-show circus, he would have walked the carpet. The man earned his piece. Down in the theater, the energy reached its crescendo. House lights dimmed to black, and the massive LED screen behind the stage blazed to life with the Academy's golden logo. 3,000 people fell silent. That collective intake of breath that marked the transition from anticipation to experience. In the wings, Dwayne received his cue from the stage manager. Center seconds. He closed his eyes briefly, centering himself in the moment. When he opened them, his expression had shifted into performance mode, confident, magnetic, ready to own the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed across the theater and into homes around the world. "Welcome to the 98th Academy Awards. Please welcome your host, Trent Maddox." The orchestra swelled, spotlights blazed, and Trent strode onto the stage to thunderous applause. In the control room, Maya exhaled slowly, watching her carefully choreographed vision come to life. Everything was perfect. Everything was controlled. Everything was exactly as planned, at least for now. 23 minutes into the broadcast, Dwayne Johnson stood in the wings. Watching Trent navigate the opening monologue with practiced ease, the audience was warm, responsive, every punchline landing exactly as the writers had crafted them. Maya's voice in his earpiece was calm, almost bored with how smoothly things were running. "Rock, you're on in 90 seconds, she said. "Just remember, nice and easy." "The room's feeling good." Dwayne nodded to no one in particular, rolling his shoulders one final time as he reviewed his mental notes. The script was clean. A few jokes about this year's nominees, a gentle roast of Hollywood's obsession with reboots and sequels, and then the Chuck Norris bit. Simple, safe, guaranteed to land with this crowd. His cue came as Trent finished a sequence about the Best Picture nominees. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson." The applause was immediate and genuine. This audience knew charisma when they saw it. Dwayne strode center stage with that loose-limbed confidence that had made him a star, his smile wide enough to reach the back balcony. The lights were brilliant, white-hot, exactly the way he liked them. And the energy in the room felt like electricity in his veins. "Thank you. Thank you," he said, waiting for the applause to settle. "It's great to be here at the Oscars, where Hollywood celebrates the very best in storytelling. Artistry, And he paused for effect, pretending to be other people for money. Laughter rippled through the theater. Perfect. He was in his element. Now I have to say, looking at this year's nominees, I'm seeing a lot of sequels, a lot of reboots, a lot of, hey, remember that thing you loved? Here it is again, but with better CGI, more laughter, which is great news for those of us who peaked in the early 2000s. It was building momentum now, feeding off the audience's energy. In the front rows, he could see familiar faces, actors he'd worked with, directors who'd shaped his career, industry titans, nodding along with his observations. This was what he lived for, the connection, the shared moment of joy. But speaking of legends from another era, Dwayne continued, his tone shifting slightly as he approached the scripted material, I have to give a shout out to all the action stars who paved the way for guys like me. Stallone, Schwarzenegger. He paused, letting his eyes scan the audience as if searching for someone specific. And of course, Chuck Norris. The mention of the name drew scattered applause and a few knowing chuckles. Dwayne pressed forward, confident in his material. Now Chuck Norris, there's a name that brings back memories. The man, the myth, the meme. He gestured broadly, his voice taking on the cadence of a carnival barker. I mean, we all grew up hearing those Chuck Norris facts, right? Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups. He pushes the earth down. When Chuck Norris enters a room, he doesn't turn the lights on, he turns the dark off. The laughter was building, but something felt different about it, thinner somehow, more hesitant than his opening material. Dwayne attributed it to the shift from general Hollywood humor to specific personal references. Time to bring it home. And hey, the man's still out there, still kicking. I heard he's been teaching martial arts to kids doing charity work, basically living like a real-life superhero, while the rest of us just play them in movies. His grin widened. But let's be honest, folks. At this point, Chuck Norris isn't just a man anymore. He's transcended into pure legend status. He's like Dwayne's search for the right comparison. His timing, impeccable. He's like the Bigfoot of action heroes. Everyone's heard the stories, but when's the last time anyone actually spotted him in the wild? The joke landed with scattered laughter, but not the wave of approval he'd expected. Something was off. Dwayne's performer's instinct kicked in. When a joke doesn't fully connect, you pivot, you adjust, you find your way back to solid ground. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I mean, these days, Chuck Norris is more meme than man, he continued, doubling down with the confidence that had always served him well. He's become this mythical figure that exists more in internet jokes than in actual movies, which is fine. Legends should be legendary, right? But maybe it's time we updated some of those Chuck Norris facts for 2026. Like Chuck. Norris doesn't need GPS. The Earth just knows where he wants to go. Chuck Norris doesn't age time, just slows down out of respect. And Chuck Norris doesn't actually attend award shows. He just exists in the collective memory of everyone who ever wanted to be tough. The laughter was polite now, scattered, uncertain. Dwayne could feel the energy in the room shifting, but he couldn't quite identify why. His material was solid. His delivery was on point, and the setup was classic award show fare, gentle ribbing of a beloved figure. In the control room, Marcus had been following his standard protocol, cutting between shots of Dwayne and reaction shots of the audience. The nominees were smiling politely. Industry veterans were nodding along. Everything looked normal. Then Mia's voice cut through his headset. Marcus, give me a shot of Chuck Norris. He's front row, third seat from the aisle. Marcus's finger moved to the camera 3 control, and the image on his monitor shifted to a close-up of the man himself. What he saw made him pause. Chuck Norris sat perfectly still, his expression completely unreadable. No smile, no frown, no indication whatsoever of how he was receiving Dwayne's material. His dark eyes were focused entirely on the stage, and there was something in his stillness that felt less like amusement and more like evaluation. Maya, Marcus said quietly, you seeing this? On her bank of monitors, Maya watched the same image. Chuck's face revealed nothing, but his posture had shifted almost imperceptibly. He was no longer the relaxed audience member of 20 minutes ago. Now he sat with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was listening to every word with absolute clarity. "Stay on him," Maya said, "but keep it brief." "I don't want to." She never finished the sentence. On every monitor in the control room, they watched Chuck Norris slowly, deliberately stand up. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was simply a man rising from his seat with the kind of controlled movement that drew every eye in his vicinity. Evelyn Sharp looked up at him with a mixture of concern and understanding. The people in the seats around him turned to see what had caught his attention. And then, as if by some invisible signal, a hush began to spread through the theater. On stage, Dwayne was still speaking, still working through his material. But he could feel the change in the room like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. His performer's instincts screamed that something had shifted, but he couldn't see what. "Like I said," he continued, his voice carrying a slight edge now as he tried to regain the energy. "Chuck Norris isn't just a person anymore. He's become this perfect symbol of toughness that we all measure ourselves against. Which is probably why he doesn't need to show up to things like this. The legend is bigger than rock." Maya's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Urgent now." Chuck Norris just stood up. He's in the front row. Camera 3 has him in frame. For the first time in his performance career, Dwayne Johnson felt his confidence waver mid-sentence. He looked out into the audience, squinting slightly against the stage lights, trying to locate the man he'd been discussing as if he were a fictional character. Marcus, following his instincts as a veteran camera operator, cut to a wide shot that included both the stage and the front section of the audience. On screens around the world, viewers could now see Dwayne Johnson on stage and Chuck Norris standing quietly in the third row. The two men separated by 30 feet and a gulf of misunderstanding. The silence in the theater was becoming noticeable now. Conversations died mid-sentence as people turned to see what was happening. Cell phones emerged from pockets and purses, their screens glowing like fireflies in the dimmed theater. The controlled atmosphere of the Academy Awards was giving way to something unscripted, unpredictable. Chuck stood with his hands at his sides, his expression still unreadable. He wasn't angry, at least not visibly. But there was something in his stillness and the way he held Dwayne's gaze across the theater that communicated more than any words could have. This wasn't a man enjoying a roast. This was a man who had heard enough. Evelyn Sharp reached up and touched Chuck's arm gently, a gesture so subtle that only the closest cameras caught it. Her face showed concern, not for any potential confrontation, but for the man she'd known for over a decade. It's a man whose entire life had been built on dignity, respect, and service to others. On stage, Dwayne felt the weight of 3,000 stares and the pressure of live television. His mouth went slightly dry as he realized that his casual dismissal of Chuck Norris as a mythical figure had been delivered to a room that included the man himself. The joke that had seemed so harmless in rehearsal now felt heavy with unintended disrespect. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dwayne said, his voice slightly less certain now, "I think we might have a special guest in the audience tonight." The words felt hollow as soon as he spoke them. In the control room, Maya was making rapid calculations. Cut to commercial. Stay with the moment. Pan away from Chuck. Focus on the crowd reaction. Every choice carried consequences that could ripple far beyond this single broadcast. Marcus kept his camera trained on the wide shot, capturing the standoff between performer and audience member. He'd covered enough live television to recognize a moment that would define an entire evening. This wasn't going back in the bottle. Chuck Norris remained standing, his presence somehow growing larger despite his stillness. He wasn't making a scene. He was simply being present in a way that demanded acknowledgement. The man who had been discussed as a relic, a meme, a figure from the past was standing in the present, quiet and solid and undeniably real. In that moment, the carefully curated world of the Academy Awards collided with something unscripted and authentic. The joke had stopped being funny. The moment it became personal, and everyone in the theater, from the A-list nominees to the control room crew to the global audience watching at home, understood that something had fundamentally changed. The silence stretched on, pregnant with possibility and tension. as two men who had never met face to face found themselves connected by a moment that neither had scripted, neither had wanted, and neither could take back. In the control room, 4 floors. Above the theater, Maya Alvarez felt her carefully orchestrated evening spiraling beyond her control. Banks of monitors showed the same impossible image from multiple angles. Chuck Norris standing in the front row like a statue, Dwayne Johnson frozen mid-joke on stage, and 3,000 audience members caught between confusion and fascination. "Talk to me, people," Maya said into her headset, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Camera 4, give me a close-up on Chuck's face." Camera 7, tight on Dwayne. Audio. "Are we picking up any conversation from the front row?" The responses came rapid fire through her earpiece. "Chuck's not saying anything, just standing there." "Dwayne looks like he swallowed his tongue." "Audio's clean." "No chatter from the front section?" Maya's mind raced through options. 28 years of live television had taught her that the worst mistakes came from overcorrecting in moments of crisis. But this was uncharted territory. Chuck Norris wasn't some unhinged celebrity having a meltdown. He was a respected figure whose mere presence commanded attention. And now that presence was focused like a laser on their biggest star. "Maya," Marcus called from his director's station, his voice unusually tense. "Social media is exploding. Number Chuck Norris stands is already trending. Twitter's calling it everything from epic showdown to disrespectful comedy bombing. We need to make a choice now." The weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders. Cut away and risk missing a historic moment. Stay with it and potentially broadcast a confrontation that could define both men's careers. The global audience was approaching peak viewership numbers. Over 400 million people were watching this unfold in real time. Stay with the wide shot, she decided. No close-ups on either of them, unless something actually happens, and get Trent ready to step in if this goes south. On stage, Dwayne Johnson experienced something he hadn't felt since his earliest wrestling matches: genuine uncertainty about how to handle an unscripted situation. He could see Chuck now standing with that perfect stillness that somehow commanded more attention than any grand gesture could have. The weight of his earlier words hung in the air between them like smoke. "Well," Dwayne said, forcing his trademark grin back into place, "I guess that proves Chuck Norris facts are still true." Chuck Norris can hear standing ovations before they happen. A few scattered chuckles emerged from the audience, but they felt forced, nervous. The energy in the room had shifted into something heavier, more complex than simple entertainment. This wasn't a bit anymore. This was real, and everyone could feel it. In the wings, stage left, Trent Maddox clutched his backup cue cards with white knuckles. As the night's host, he was responsible for keeping the show moving. But stepping into this particular moment felt like defusing a bomb while blindfolded. Both Chuck Norris and The Rock were his childhood heroes in different ways. The stoic action star who never broke character, and the charismatic entertainer who could charm any crowd. Watching them locked in this wordless confrontation felt like witnessing his own mythology tear itself apart. "Should I go out there?" he whispered to his assistant. "Try to smooth this over." The woman shook her head. "Maya says to stay put unless she gives the word. But be ready." Ready for what? Neither of them could say. Back in the front row, Evelyn Sharp watched Chuck with the kind of understanding that comes from decades of friendship. She'd seen him navigate hostile interviews, disrespectful journalists, in countless attempts to reduce his life's work to punchlines. But this felt different. This wasn't some tabloid reporter looking for a reaction. This was happening in front of an audience that included many of the people Chuck respected most in the entertainment industry. "Chuck," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the ambient tension. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone." Chuck's response was so soft that only she could hear it. "It's not about proving anything, Evelyn. It's about respect." The word carried weight that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Respect for the work he'd done, the causes he'd supported, the people he'd helped. Respect for the difference between being a person and being a punchline. Respect for the idea that legends were built on substance, not just stories. In the control room, Maya watched the standoff with growing dread. The longer it went on, the more it looked like a confrontation rather than a misunderstanding. Social media was fracturing into camps. Some supporting Dwayne's right to make jokes, others defending Chuck's dignity. Celebrity Twitter was already picking sides, and the show wasn't even halfway over. "Marcus, give me audience reactions," she said. "I want to see how the room is reading this." The camera swept across the first few rows, catching expressions that ranged from fascination to concern to barely concealed excitement. Some nominees looked uncomfortable, as if they'd rather be anywhere else. Others leaned forward in their seats, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Alice director Stephen Chen was captured, whispering to his wife, "This is either going to be brilliant or catastrophic." Actress Jennifer Lawrence sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, clearly trying to process whether this was part of the show. Producer Michael Bay looked like he was already planning how to turn this moment into a movie. The collective audience had become a character in its own right. Thousands of individual reactions coalescing into a single entity that fed on tension and uncertainty. On stage, Dwayne made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Instead of trying to joke his way out of the moment or pretend nothing had happened, he acknowledged the elephant in the room. "You know what?" he said, his voice carrying less of his usual bravado and more genuine uncertainty. "I think I might have just learned the difference between talking about a legend and talking to one." The admission drew a different kind of response from the audience. Not laughter, but a collective exhale that suggested recognition of something real and unscripted. For the first time since Chuck had stood up, the energy in the room shifted slightly, moving away from confrontation towards something more complex. Chuck's expression remained unreadable, but something in his posture suggested he was listening. Really listening, not to the words themselves, but to the intention behind them. In the control room, Maya felt a slight easing of the knot in her stomach. "That's good," she murmured. "That's real, Marcus. Stay with this angle. Both of them in frame. Let the moment breathe." Liam Porter, the head of security for the Academy Awards, had been monitoring the situation from multiple angles throughout the theater. His team was positioned strategically around the venue. He'd seen enough award show incidents to know when something might escalate beyond words. But this felt different. Chuck Norris wasn't exhibiting any of the warning signs of someone preparing for confrontation. No clenched fists, no aggressive body language, no movement toward the stage. He was simply standing present and still, like a mountain that had decided to make itself known. Still, Liam activated his earpiece. Team leaders maintained positions. No movement toward the front row unless specifically ordered. "This appears to be a peaceful situation, but stay alert." His instincts told him this wasn't about violence. It was about something deeper, more personal. But in his line of work, instincts were always balanced against preparation. Dwayne stood on stage, acutely aware that his next words could either diffuse the situation or escalate it beyond recovery. The silence stretched between them like a tightrope, and he realized that his usual toolkit of charm and humor might not be sufficient for this moment. "I think," he said carefully, "maybe I should have done my homework before making jokes about someone's life." It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, something in the theater's atmosphere began to shift. The audience sensed that they were witnessing not just an unscripted moment, but a real one. The kind of human interaction that award shows usually spent millions of dollars trying to avoid. Chuck Norris remained standing, his dark eyes never leaving Dwayne's face. But for the first time since he'd risen from his seat, there was something in his expression that suggested he was evaluating not just the words, but the man speaking them. The standoff continued, but it no longer felt like a confrontation waiting to explode. It felt like a conversation waiting to begin. And everyone in the theater, from the front row to the balcony, from the control room to the wings, held their breath to see what would happen next. Maya's voice crackled through the control room headsets. "We're going to commercial in 60 seconds. Whatever happens in the next minute is going to define this entire broadcast." The countdown began, but nobody was watching the clock anymore. They were watching two men navigate a moment that neither had planned, neither had wanted, but both now owned completely. The commercial break hit exactly 9:47 p.m. Pacific time, and Maya Alvarez felt like she could breathe again for the first time in 8 minutes. The red live indicators went dark throughout the Dolby Theater, and suddenly, the controlled chaos of live television transformed into something more familiar. The organized panic of damage control. "Our minutes censure seconds," Maya announced into her headset. "Trent, you're opening with the humanitarian package when we come back. Chuck's tribute segment has moved up from the third hour. We're doing it now." While the audience is focused on him anyway, Dwayne Johnson walked off stage on unsteady legs, pulling his wireless mic pack free with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. The rush of performing always left him energized, but this felt different, like coming down from a fever rather than a high. He'd been performing for audiences for 25 years, but he'd never had one turn on him quite like that. Not turn on him. Exactly. That was the problem. Chuck Norris hadn't done anything dramatic or confrontational. He'd simply stood up, and somehow, that quiet gesture had carried more weight than all of Dwayne's carefully crafted humor combined. "Jesus rock." What was that? The voice belonged to Sarah Chen, the head writer, and she appeared at his elbow the moment he cleared the wings. Her usually calm demeanor had cracked, revealing the anxiety beneath. "That wasn't in any of our scripts for how this could go wrong." Dwayne shook his head, still processing what had just happened. "I don't know. The material tested well. The jokes were solid." He trailed off, realizing how hollow the words sounded. Testing comedy in focus groups was like testing the color of water. You could measure it technically, but you'd miss the deeper currents entirely. Maya's voice cut through their conversation from speakers positioned throughout the backstage area. "Dwayne, I need you to find me when this segment is over. We need to discuss the elephant in the room." But the elephant, Dwayne realized, wasn't in the room anymore. The elephant was sitting in the front row of the theater, and it had a name, a history, and feelings that apparently ran deeper than internet memes. Across the theater in the VIP hospitality corridor that ran parallel to the main seating area, Chuck Norris walked, slowly alongside a production assistant who'd been tasked with escorting him to the humanitarian segment prep area. The young woman, maybe 25, with the kind of nervous energy that came from working her first Academy Awards, clearly had no idea how to handle the situation. "Mr. Norris," she said, consulting her tablet with shaking hands. "We've moved your presentation up to right after this break. I know it's earlier than planned, but with everything that just happened," Chuck held up a gentle hand. "It's fine. I understand." His voice was quiet, measured, carrying none of the tension that everyone expected after what had just occurred. The production assistant looked relieved, but also confused. She'd clearly been prepared for anger, demands, or at least some kind of diva behavior. Instead, she was walking alongside a man who seemed perfectly calm, despite having just been the center of a global television moment. Evelyn Sharp appeared from a side corridor, having been guided by another staff member. Her expression showed concern, not for Chuck's emotional state, but for the larger implications of what was unfolding. "That was quite something," she said, falling into step beside him. Chuck's smile was small but genuine. "Not how I planned to spend the evening. What are you thinking?" It was a loaded question, and Chuck took his time answering. They'd reached a quiet alcove near the stage entrance, where the sounds of the theater were muffled, and they could speak without being overheard. "I'm thinking," Chuck said carefully, "that young man probably didn't mean any harm, but impact matters more than intent sometimes." Evelyn studied her friend's face. After 12 years, she could read the layers of meaning in his expressions. Chuck wasn't angry. That much was clear, but he wasn't dismissive either. Something in the moment had touched a nerve, not of ego, but of purpose. "The work matters to you," she said. It wasn't a question. 47 years of it. Movies, TV shows, all of that. It was fun. It paid the bills. It gave me a platform. But the real work started afterward. The foundation, the community centers, the kids who write letters saying we help them stay off the streets. Chuck's voice carried conviction without volume. When someone reduces all of that to internet jokes, he didn't finish the sentence. But Evelyn understood. It wasn't about Chuck's feelings being hurt. It was about the risk that mockery could undermine the serious work that had become his life's mission. Legends, after all, were harder to take seriously when they were punchlines. Meanwhile, 30 yards away in another part of the backstage maze, Dwayne was having his own moment of reckoning. Maya had found him in the green room, her expression serious, but not hostile. "We need to talk about what happens when we come back," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Social media is going crazy. The moment has its own hashtag. Entertainment reporters are already calling this the most unscripted Oscars moment since the envelope mix-up." Dwayne rubbed his face, suddenly feeling older than his 53 years. "Maya, I swear I didn't know he was here." The joke was about the mythology, not the man. "I know that, but impact matters more than intent, especially on live television." Maya's tone was professional, but not unsympathetic. "The question is, where do we go from here? You're presenting again in the third hour. That's our chance to either fix this or make it worse." The weight of the choice settled on Dwayne's shoulders. He could double down, play it off as overreaction to harmless humor. He could ignore it entirely and hope the news cycle moved on to something else. Or he could do something that went against every instinct he developed as a performer. He could be vulnerable in front of 400 million people. "What does Chuck want?" he asked. Maya looked surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" Has anyone asked him what he wants? An apology for me to never mention his name again? For this to just go away?" Dwayne's voice carried genuine confusion because I honestly don't know what I did wrong, and I honestly don't know how to fix it. Before Maya could answer, a commotion in the corridor outside caught their attention. Through the green room's glass door, they could see Chuck Norris walking slowly toward the stage entrance, flanked by Evelyn and the production assistant. His demeanor remained calm, but there was something in his bearing that suggested a man preparing for something significant. Dwayne stood up impulsively. "I want to talk to him." "Rock, I don't think." But Dwayne was already moving toward the door. Something in his gut told him that this moment required direct human interaction, not publicist-managed damage control. He'd built his career on authenticity, even when it was performative authenticity. Maybe it was time to try the real thing. The corridor was busy with the controlled chaos of a live broadcast crew members moving equipment, celebrities being escorted to various positions, coordination happening at full speed. But somehow, in the middle of it all, Dwayne Johnson and Chuck Norris ended up face to face. It happened naturally, inevitably, as if the universe had been waiting for this moment to occur away from cameras and audiences. Chuck was walking toward his segment prep area, and Dwayne was walking away from the green room. And their paths intersected in the neutral territory of a backstage hallway. For a moment, neither man spoke. They were roughly the same height, but their presence filled the space differently. Dwayne carried the energy of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Chuck carried the stillness of someone who had never needed to demand it. "Chuck," Dwayne said, his voice quieter than usual. "I think we need to talk." Chuck studied the younger man's face, looking for something beneath the performer's mask. What he saw there wasn't arrogance or defensiveness, but genuine confusion and something that might have been regret. "All right," Chuck said simply. The production assistant looked between them uncertainly, clearly unsure whether to interrupt or facilitate. Evelyn caught her eye and nodded toward the stage area, a gentle suggestion that they could handle this themselves. "I want you to know," Dwayne began, "that wasn't about you personally, the jokes. It was about the mythology, the internet thing. The way your name has become this symbol of—" "I know what it was about," Chuck interrupted gently. "But here's the thing, son. There's a difference between laughing with someone and laughing at what they've given their life to." The words hit Dwayne like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. In that moment, he realized that he'd been treating Chuck Norris like a fictional character, rather than a real person who had spent decades building something meaningful. "I've been working with kids for 15 years, Chuck continued, his voice calm but firm. "Gang prevention, martial arts programs, literacy campaigns. When people hear my name and think joke instead of mentor or teacher or someone who gives a damn," he shrugged slightly, "that makes the work harder." Dwayne felt something shift in his chest. Not quite shame, but a recognition of impact he hadn't considered. I never thought about it that way. Most people don't. It's easier to think of public figures as characters than as human beings with missions that matter to them. Chuck's expression wasn't angry or accusatory. If anything, it was patient, as if he was used to having this conversation in different forms. "What can I do?" Dwayne asked, and the question surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise Chuck. "That's up to you," Chuck replied. "But whatever you decide, make sure it's real. People can tell the difference." The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it carried the weight of a much longer exchange. When Chuck continued toward his segment prep area, and Dwayne headed back to the green room, both men had been changed by the encounter. Maya was waiting when Dwayne returned, her expression expectant. "How did it go?" Dwayne sat down heavily in his chair, processing what had just occurred. "I think," he said slowly, "I just met a legend who turned out to be a human being. I think I owe him and everyone watching something more honest than I've been giving them." In the distance, they could hear the stage manager calling for places. The commercial break was almost over, and Chuck's humanitarian tribute was about to begin. In a few minutes, the global audience would see the man behind the mythology, and Dwayne would have to decide what kind of person he wanted to be when the cameras turned back to him. The choice, as Chuck had said, was his. But for the first time in his career, he understood that the real performance wasn't about being bigger than life. It was about being truthful within it. The red live indicators blazed back to life at 9:50 p.m. Pacific time, and Trent Maddox appeared at center stage with an expression that balanced professional composure with genuine respect. The energy in the theater had shifted during the commercial break. Conversations had died down. Phones had been put away, and the audience sat with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for the biggest award presentations. "Welcome back to the 98th Academy Awards," Trent said, his voice carrying more gravity than it had all evening. "Tonight, we're honored to recognize individuals who use their platform not just to entertain, but to change lives. The Stoyart Foundation Humanitarian Award recognizes lifetime achievement in community service and charitable work. And this year's recipient has spent over 15 years quietly transforming the lives of young people across America." In the wings, Dwayne Johnson stood with Maya Alvarez and several other production staff, watching the monitor as Trent's introduction unfolded. The words carried weight that Dwayne was only now beginning to understand. This wasn't about recognizing a celebrity's charity work as a public relations exercise. This was about honoring someone who had dedicated the latter half of his life to service that had nothing to do with cameras or applause. The recipient of this year's Stoyart Foundation Humanitarian Award has founded 17 community centers, mentored over 3,000 at-risk youth, and raised more than $40 million for gang prevention and literacy programs. Please welcome a true American legend, Chuck Norris. The applause that filled the theater was different from the enthusiastic but shallow clapping that had greeted most presenters. This was sustained, genuine. It came from people who were learning for the first time about work that had been happening away from spotlights for over a decade. As Chuck walked slowly onto the stage, the ovation grew rather than diminished. As if the audience was processing the magnitude of what they'd just heard, Chuck moved with the same quiet dignity he'd shown all evening. But now, the context had shifted completely. This wasn't a man being roasted for internet memes. This was someone being honored for a lifetime of substance that had nothing to do with entertainment industry mythology. In the control room, Marcus Hale found himself making different choices than he'd planned. Instead of the standard celebrity reaction shots, he focused on Chuck's face as he acknowledged the applause. The slight smile that suggested both humility and deep satisfaction in work well done. The cameras captured something that was increasingly rare in contemporary Hollywood: authentic gravitas that hadn't been manufactured for public consumption. "Thank you," Chuck said as the applause finally settled. His voice carried easily through the theater's sound system, but it felt intimate somehow, as if he was speaking to each person individually rather than to a crowd. "When I started making movies and TV shows 47 years ago, I thought that would be my legacy. Entertainment action scenes, maybe making people laugh or feel a little tougher for 90 minutes. He paused, and the silence was complete. 3,000 people hung on his words with the kind of attention that couldn't be commanded, only earned. But I learned something as I got older. Real strength isn't about who can throw the hardest punch or who can take the most punishment. Real strength is about what you do when nobody's watching. It's about showing up for people who can't necessarily help your career or add to your legend. It's about using whatever platform you've been given to make the world a little better than you found it. In the monitor, Dwayne watched as Chuck's words landed with increasing impact. The audience was completely still, but their attention was electric. This wasn't a speech. It was a testament. Delivered by someone who had clearly thought deeply about what his life meant beyond the entertainment that had made him famous. The young people I've had the privilege to work with have taught me more than I could ever teach them, Chuck continued. They've shown me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about choosing to do the right thing even when you are afraid. They've taught me that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through consistency, through service, through showing up day after day without expecting recognition. The camera found Evelyn sharp in the front row, her eyes bright with tears of pride. It captured other faces in the audience industry, veterans who were clearly being reminded of purposes beyond fame. Younger actors who seemed to be learning something about what a career could become with time and intention. "Violence is easy," Chuck said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades understanding the difference between real and performative strength. Anyone can destroy, anyone can tear down, but building something, a community center, a mentorship program, a young person's belief in themselves that takes everything you've got every day for years, that's the work that matters. Not because it makes headlines, but because it makes a difference. Maya found herself watching the social media feeds on her tablet, expecting the usual mix of commentary and snark that accompanied most award show moments. Instead, she saw something unusual. People were sharing stories. Stories about teachers who had changed their lives, about coaches who had believed in them, about moments when someone had shown up for them without expecting anything in return. Chuck's speech was catalyzing something larger than itself. "I accept this award not for myself, but for every person who chooses service over spotlight," Chuck concluded. "For every mentor who sees potential where others see problems. For every volunteer who shows up because the work matters, not because anyone's watching. The real heroes aren't the ones getting awards, they're the ones getting up tomorrow morning to do the work again." The standing ovation began before Chuck finished his last sentence and continued long after he'd left the stage. It was the kind of applause that comes from recognizing something genuine and significant. Not just entertainment, but inspiration. The audience was on its feet, not because protocol demanded it, but because they'd been reminded of what public life could aspire to beyond mere celebrity. Backstage, Dwayne felt the full weight of contrast between his earlier joke and the reality he'd just witnessed. The mythology he'd been mocking wasn't about martial arts prowess or internet memes. It was about a man who had quietly become exactly the kind of hero the myth suggested, just not in the way anyone expected. "Maya," he said quietly, "when I come out for my next presentation, I'm not reading the prompter." Maya looked at him with the weariness of someone who'd already had. "Enough surprises for one evening? Rock. Whatever you're thinking." "I'm thinking," Dwayne interrupted, "that I just watched a masterclass in what it means to be a legend. And I realized I've been playing dress-up while he was doing the real work." On stage, Trent was wrapping up the humanitarian segment with the kind of sincere respect that transformed a ward, show-pattering reverence. "Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Norris, recipient of the Stoyart Foundation Humanitarian Award." The applause continued as Chuck exited, but its impact lingered in the theater like the resonance of a struck bell. The audience had been changed by what they'd heard, not entertained, but genuinely moved by the recognition of work that mattered beyond the entertainment. Industry's carefully constructed universe. In his dressing room, Chuck sat quietly with Evelyn as the sounds of the continuing broadcast filtered through the walls. The award sat on a small table between them, but neither of them was looking at it. Instead, they sat with the satisfaction that comes from seeing important work acknowledged by people whose opinions matter. "That was beautiful," Evelyn said. Chuck nodded slowly. "The work speaks for itself. It always has." In the earlier moment, Chuck considered the question. That young man has some thinking to do, but thinking can lead to good things if he lets it. 2 floors above them, Dwayne Johnson was doing exactly that kind of thinking. In less than an hour, he'd be back on stage presenting in the same spot where he'd made jokes about mythology, while the real man sat 30 feet away. The question now wasn't whether he'd address what had happened. It was whether he'd have the courage to do it with the same authenticity Chuck had just demonstrated. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. One man had used his moment in the spotlight to celebrate himself and his perspective on others. The other had used his moment to honor the work that defined his life's meaning. The difference between them wasn't about talent or charisma or even good intentions. It was about the choice between performance and truth. And in that difference, Dwayne Johnson began to understand what Chuck Norris had been trying to tell him in their brief backstage encounter. The real test of character wasn't whether you could avoid making mistakes. It was whether you could recognize them, learn from them, and choose to do better the next time the spotlight found you. The final hour of the Academy Awards always carried a different energy than the earlier segments. A sense of culmination of approaching the night's biggest moments. By 10:47 p.m. Pacific Time, the major awards had been distributed. The musical performances had been delivered and the global audience was settling in, the traditional crescendo toward Best Picture. But tonight felt different. That Chuck Norris. The moment had shifted something fundamental in the evening's atmosphere. And everyone from the nominees to the crew, to the viewers at home, sensed that the night's most important moment might still be ahead. Dwayne Johnson stood in the wings, holding the envelope for Best Cinematography. But his mind was focused on something far more significant than the scripted presentation he was supposed to deliver. His hands, which had felt steady through countless high-pressure performances, trembled almost imperceptibly as he reviewed words that had nothing to do with the teleprompter waiting for him on stage. Maya Alvarez stood beside him, her expression tense with the knowledge that they were about to find out whether one of Hollywood's biggest stars would salvage or sabotage what remained of the evening. She'd managed celebrity crises before, but this felt different, more personal, less controllable. The usual damage control playbook didn't apply when the damage was to something as intangible as respect. "Rock," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the orchestral interlude playing in the theater. "I know you want to address what happened earlier, but remember, 400 million people are watching. Whatever you do up there becomes part of Oscar history. This isn't just about you and Chuck anymore. It's about what the Academy Awards represent." Dwayne nodded, understanding the weight of her words, but feeling something deeper pulling him forward. Chuck's earlier observation echoed in his mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. People can tell the difference between real and performative. He'd spent 25 years building a career on a specific kind of performative authenticity. Calculated spontaneity that felt genuine while remaining safely controlled. His entire public persona was built on being unflappable, always having the right response, never showing genuine uncertainty. Tonight, for the first time, he was considering abandoning that safety net entirely. "I know what I need to do," he said. And Maya heard something in his voice that she'd never heard before. Not the confidence of a performer who knew his material would land, but the uncertainty of a human being about to risk something genuinely important. It reminded her of actors she'd worked with who were attempting roles that stretched them beyond their comfort zones. Except this wasn't a role. This was real life happening in front of the largest audience of his career. Around them, the controlled chaos of live television continued. Camera operators adjusted their positions, audio technicians monitored levels, and production assistants moved with the purposeful urgency that marked the final segments of any major broadcast. But in the small circle of space where Dwayne and Maya stood, time felt suspended, pregnant with possibility and consequence. Trent Maddox appeared on stage to introduce him. "Ellie!" His voice carrying the professional warmth that had served him well throughout the evening. But even Trent seemed to understand that something significant was approaching. His introduction was more measured than usual, less showmanship, and more genuine respect for whatever was about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the Academy Award for Best Cinematography, Dwayne Johnson." The applause that greeted Dwayne's name was polite, but notably cooler than his earlier reception. Not hostile exactly, but cautious. The theater was full of people who were curious about whether he would acknowledge. what had happened, or pretend it hadn't occurred. Some celebrities in the front rows exchanged glances that suggested shared uncertainty about what they were about to witness. The walk to center stage felt longer than usual, each step carrying him further from the safety of scripted material and closer to a moment of genuine vulnerability that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. The theater's acoustics picked up the sound of his footsteps, amplifying them into something that felt almost ceremonial. The lights were the same brilliant, white-hot beams he'd performed under countless times before. But they felt different now, less like spotlights designed to make him look heroic, more like honest illumination that would reveal whatever truth he chose to share. In the control room, Marcus Hale made minute adjustments to his camera angles, instinctively understanding that this moment required different visual treatment than a standard presentation. Instead of the usual close-ups that emphasize star power and charisma, he found himself choosing wider shots that captured context, relationship, the human scale of what was happening. Maya watched from the wings, her tablet showing social media feeds that were already buzzing with anticipation. Oscars' apology was beginning to trend, though no one yet knew what form that apology might take, or even if it would happen at all. The speculation ranged from cynical predictions of calculated damage control to hopeful expectations of genuine accountability. Dwayne reached the podium and looked out at the audience, his eyes naturally finding Chuck Norris in the third row. The older man sat with the same quiet attention he'd maintained all evening, but there was something in his expression that suggested openness, a willingness to listen that hadn't been there during their earlier confrontation. Evelyn Sharp sat beside him, her face showing curiosity mixed with protective concern for her friend. The silence in the theater stretched for several seconds longer than was comfortable, as if Dwayne was gathering courage from some deep well within himself. The audience, global viewing audience, was experiencing something increasingly rare in contemporary media, a moment of genuine substance happening without irony, manipulation, or calculated effect. Social media engagement was spiking, but the conversation was notably different from the usual celebrity scandal cycle. People were sharing personal stories, reflecting on their own relationships with power and responsibility, discussing what it meant to use influence constructively. So before we celebrate the artists who help us see stories in new ways, Dwayne concluded, bringing his unscripted remarks full circle back to the evening's ostensible purpose, I wanted to make sure we also remember the people who help us see ourselves more clearly. Chuck, thank you for that reminder. Everyone, thank you for listening, and thank you for showing me that the best performances happen when you stop performing and start being real. The applause began slowly, scattered at first as the audience processed what they had just witnessed. Then it built into something sustained and genuine. Not the explosive enthusiasm of entertainment appreciation, but the deeper satisfaction of witnessing authentic human growth. People were clapping not just for Dwayne's words, but for his willingness to risk his carefully constructed image in service of something more honest and meaningful. The standing ovation that followed was different from any other that night. Less ceremonial, more spontaneous, carrying the energy of genuine respect rather than professional courtesy. In the front row, Chuck stood with the rest of the audience, his applause but sincere, his expression showing something that might have been satisfaction at seeing courage rewarded with grace. As the applause continued, Dwayne moved smoothly into his presentation of the Cinematography Award. But the atmosphere in the theater had been permanently altered. The audience had witnessed something that award shows rarely provided: genuine character development happening in real time, without scripts or safety nets, or the usual protective layers of celebrity presentation. When he announced the winner, his voice carried new authenticity that made even the scripted portions of his presentation feel more substantial. The recipients in turn seemed moved by the context in which they were receiving their recognition, part of an evening that had reminded everyone present about the difference between performance and truth. Later, as the evening wound toward its conclusion, with the traditional presentation of Best Picture, photographers would capture one more image that would become iconic in its own way. Dwayne Johnson and Chuck Norris shaking hands in the aisle as attendees filed out of the theater. The handshake occurred naturally, spontaneously as their paths crossed near the exit. Chuck's expression showed the quiet satisfaction of someone who had seen character triumph over ego, while Dwayne's face carried the relief and humility of someone who had chosen growth over image protection. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but it represented something larger. The possibility that public figures could learn, adapt, become better versions of themselves when challenged to do so with grace rather than hostility. The moment suggested that strength could be redefined not as the absence of mistakes, but as the courage to acknowledge them and choose differently. In that simple gesture of mutual respect, both men demonstrated what leadership could look like when it prioritized character over charisma, substance over spectacle. In the days that followed, the moment would be analyzed endlessly by media critics, social commentators, and celebrity watchers. But the immediate impact was simpler and more profound. Two men had met in a moment of conflict and chosen to transform it into an opportunity for understanding, growth, and mutual respect. And in that transformation, everyone watching learned something about what real strength looked like when it stopped trying to impress and started trying to serve something larger than itself. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe.